Well, thank you for those who have joined us this morning, and hopefully a few more people trickle in as the session gets going. Basically, what this session is going to be about is to talk about the uncertainty and turmoil that we're all facing globally, and the mounting public pressure from citizens to hold governments accountable, to be more transparent and open and responsive for delivering services. And of course, the pandemic has really surfaced many cracks in a lot of contexts, including where I'm from here in Canada, in Europe, but really globally around the world. And so really citizens are more and more looking to hold governments accountable for both efficient service delivery, but also equitable service delivery to reach even the most marginalized communities. In many parts of the world, the space for civil society and civic space has also been closing in recent years, and freedom of expression has become more and more limited. And in that space, there is a critical role for think tanks to play, to hold governments accountable and to try and really advocate for citizen rights. And so I'll just kick off by introducing myself. I'm Julie LaFrance, and I'm an OTT associate, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. But before we kick into the session, I'd like to introduce our panelists this morning. We have Kwame Owino, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Economic Affairs in Kenya, a think tank that has been around for a long time, and I got to know over the past 10 years or so through the Think Tank Initiative, which Kwame's organization participated in. We have David Gomez Alvarez, who's the Executive Director of Transversal, a think tank in Mexico. And we also have Alfonsina Peñaloza, who is the Director of Co-Impact, which is a global philanthropic collaborative. She is also formerly a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation, and before that, she actually was executive director of another Mexican think tank a few years back now. And so, without further ado, I will invite our two think tankers, Kwame and David, to provide a little bit of context. Maybe we'll start with you, Kwame. I mean, I understand that under Vision 2030 in Kenya, there's a strong aim to achieve transparent, equitable, and ethical results-oriented government institutions by 2030. I'm also aware that starting back in 2010, there was a devolution process that took place that really shifted the power dynamics to the counties in Kenya, and really gave more power to the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches more at a local level. And so I wonder if you could start off by giving us a little bit of context about what's happening in Kenya these days, before we get into a few questions in a little while.
All right. Okay, thanks. I think you'd summarize the state of play in Kenya in three units. First, a situation of public debt distress, in the sense that in the last 8 years, the government of Kenya has run consistently 7 to 8% of GDP debt, deficit. Obviously, that has built up the amount of debt. The second problem is a question of the pandemic. Obviously started last year, and infections have been going up. So obviously that's led to a freeze. And the collapse of growth, which happened last year, partly because everything had to be, there was restrictions the government of Kenya brought in to manage. And the third point is basically a vaccination program has started, which in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs is both a tool for economic growth, for resumption of economic activity, and at the same time for the management of the pandemic. So we have these three factors which actually predominate. Government revenues have collapsed, which means obviously the devolution process itself is partly actually it's fundamentally affected because the amount of revenues that government could pass over to them based on the constitutional imperative is a stress. Then we have Kenyans who are completely unhappy about economic management over the last 8 years. So we have all those cluster of factors underpinned by the three that I mentioned, and that forms the context today. Thanks.
Well, in the case of Latin America and in Mexico, I would say there are three crises going on. The first, obviously, is the economic crisis provoked by the pandemic, which obviously has put a lot of pressure in the economies. Millions of new poor people, unemployment, and so on. But I would say that the other particularity of Latin America and Mexico is the political representation crisis. The eruption of populisms from right and side wings, and that has put a lot of pressure on democratic institutions, and there's a lot of pressure on democratic regression. And also, I see another crisis, a social crisis, due to polarization and inequality, so that the combination of the three factors are putting a lot of pressure on civil society and think tanks in the region, and particularly in Mexico, where democratic institutions are failing, are not working as they used to be. And that means that civil society has more pressure on and less space and less resources, but a lot of things to say and to do in these moments in the region, and in particular in Mexico. I would say it that way, Julie.
Okay, so just to our audience, I just wanted to invite, if you have any questions throughout the session, please include them in the chat, and we'll try and weave them into our discussion as we go along. So really the first question I have for all of you, and actually maybe Alfonsina, since we haven't heard from you yet, I'll start with you. But what role do you think that think tanks can play to hold governments accountable for transparent and equitable decisions, be it in Kenya or Mexico or other countries that you've worked in?
Thank you, Julie. I mean, I think the first one is quite an obvious one, but I think think tanks play sort of this role of a bridge between more grassroots activist organizations and government. I think think tanks usually have a particular set of staff who have, with some exceptions, and David and Kwame have already pointed to some of these in some contexts. I think this is definitely the case of Kenya and Mexico and many other countries today, but usually have very well-established, trusted political knowledge and decision makers. And I think that makes think tanks particularly relevant. The type of roles that think tanks play go way beyond just research. They, in my experience, for example, in Mexico, most think tanks were commonly asked for technical assistance, especially in legislative, giving legal testimonies. They sit on committees. They regularly meet with government and decision makers. So there's a lot that happens behind the scenes from what's mostly visible, from what we see sort of when reports are launched. And I think think tanks are particularly well set to play what I call the insider-outsider game, which is that maintaining a critical role and maintaining independence. I think they have this ability to both play within sort of government institutions and play sort of with the game, the political game in a way, but also play this role of the outsider, the monitor, the one who holds government accountable. And I think think tanks are particularly well set up to do that in a way other types of civil society organizations are not as well set up to do. I think think tanks, this is not necessarily the case of many of them, unfortunately, for many reasons that we can get into later, but having a very dedicated and strategic communication strategy is really important. Again, this insider-outsider role that they play, they have the ability to both set an agenda within government, but they can also, with sophisticated communication strategies, use the outsider game to place issues on the public agenda and functioning sort of as a translator between regular citizens and government. I think particularly, for example, in the case of transparency and accountability, technical term, it's super technocratic. A lot of citizens might not necessarily understand the relevance of transparency and accountability in their day-to-day lives. And I think that think tanks can create this a critical mass, which in some cases, in the cases of closing civic space, which we'll talk about perhaps in a little bit, can provide a very powerful advocacy strategy where you can combine approaches that think tanks usually do with sort of more social movements, and I think that can be incredibly relevant. So again, the play of the role of the translator, the evidence-based research, which is essential to informing government decisions. I think today more than ever, we know that information and truth play a really critical role, and particularly in authoritarian and autocratic regimes. What is true and what is evidence-based is even more necessary than ever. So I think that producing sort of trusted, verifiable information that can guide government decision making is essential to the role of it.
Thank you so much, Alfonsina. That's fantastic. I mean, it's a delicate relationship, this inside-outsider role, and who you're too close to, and how your perception of independence is always, you know, view. So I wonder, Kwame, if you would maybe react to some of the things that Alfonsina has mentioned, and maybe give us some examples, some concrete examples. Debbie, do you have a quick question that you wanted to add?
After Kwame.
Okay. So Kwame, let's go to you. And if you have any examples of where you found yourself almost either too close to government to be able to hold them to account, or too close to a private sector or other interest, donor interest perhaps, that's actually jeopardized that ability to really influence.
Yeah, and I think it's the issue of the moment for Kenya. So as I say that for the last 8 years, I mean, in 2014, we had an administration elected under the new constitution in 2010. And this administration was extremely populist, obviously nearly xenophobic vibes, proclaiming stuff such as we are looking east, not looking west, for whatever reasons, because the two leaders of the administration itself were facing some investigation at the International Criminal Court based on some violence that took place in 2007 after elections. So playing the, you know, I mean, you all know that in domestic politics, blaming the foreigner works. So they had a very hard one. And among the things that they sought to do after they cleared or completely managed to frustrate the investigations, and of course the cases collapsed, was to come back home. And one of the things they smeared think tanks, civil society organizations that are not necessarily connected directly to government, is the question of the authenticity of our voice, based on the fact that, look, the IEA is an association, but a great share of our revenues every year, if I may call them that, over 80% tends to come from foundations, and obviously those international organizations, which obviously, so when we had a call, I mean, just using our basic economics theory, when we had a call about the fact that, look, you cannot run a deficit of 7% every year, 7% of GDP every year and expect it to end well. I think part of the way those voices were, or rather the response, because these guys also had a sophisticated game of people using social media tools, many moods, calling out people and obviously propagating ideas that they believed were fact, but were not. I would hate to say that they were trying to misinform. So that kind of pressure was there, and institutions actually had to state that, look, it doesn't matter what we say. I think the authenticity of our voice should come from the veracity of the claims that we make. So that fight definitely did exist, and the IEA was among them, including the fact that in Kenya, one of the ways that this happens is if you have that kind of voice, people try to use the word activism. Communication tends to be euphemistic and stuff like that. So you see them. I think everything has unraveled right now. And everybody knows whatever it is. I mean, I don't think we get points for it, but the most important thing is it's clear that some of the people who maintained the consistent view that no government anywhere could run a budget deficit of 8-9% over time, and not get into trouble. The debt distress question is back here, and it's clear that new voices will be required. So today, it's not about saying that we told you so. That today, it's about searching for new solutions, and that tends to get us back to it. Which reminds me about two things that I think, to answer the first question about what think tanks do, I think there are some normative things that think tanks need to assert every now and again. I know we try to work off evidence, but there's some normative things that we emphasize based on constitutional principles, largely in Kenya, but what we know. So asserting norms is one thing that think tanks should do. And then the second one is actually to identify and ask ourselves, issue identification and where are the gaps so that government can do better. And that's one of the things we remind ourselves of every day, whatever the context may be.
So, Kwame, can you actually just elaborate on some of those roles in the current climate, and particularly as it relates to service delivery and accountability of government to actually, you mentioned the pandemic, the vaccine program. Are there any examples that come to mind?
Yes. I mean, the first one is, let's talk pandemic. So the government of Kenya joined the COVAX initiative, which basically, of course, is put together by WHO and global institutions and part of. But if you look at it, the government of Kenya is not very big, but Kenya is a middle-income country. GDP is about $100 billion every year, and it would take just about $1.5 billion to vaccinate the entire country. But for some reason, because of the problems of recurrent debt problems, and obviously the debt distress, as we mentioned, government doesn't have space in the balance sheet, in a sense that it cannot borrow more money to actually use that, or even to effect a sensible fiscal stimulus program. So what our role is actually is to connect those two and to see how extensive debt, a high appetite for debt, as the government of Kenya has maintained, affects its ability today to meet critical public service delivery. And many Kenyans might not connect the two. And our view as think tanks is to state that, look, debt problems are actually a result, and they are a result of unrestrained borrowing. And the institutions that should have done some work, basically the legislature, to actually moderate this borrowing, were part of the mix. The Kenya's parliament has built a fantastic new headquarters of, I think, 28 floors of a building, really, really fancy, gyms, including jacuzzis. So we are connecting those quote-unquote failures in accountability to the fact that right now government, there are trade-offs, basically, trying to tell people that, look, when your government is going to spend $50 million constructing a new building, that $50 million is not available to provide vaccination services. So the government's plan in Kenya today, which is silly, which is not, funny in the sense that the government of Kenya at today's pace would probably finish the vaccination of the entire country in something like 3 years. Of course, we know that the virus is not prepared to wait for 3 years. So obviously there'll be costs based on the fact that the big thing is too much spending, indisciplined spending has opportunity costs. And that cost is trade-off is basically the ability to provide services and no reserves that could be used to respond to an emergency, both as a fiscal stimulus, but also to buy the vaccines, which, whatever people say, for a country with $100 billion in GDP, for them to buy.
So oftentimes it's a knowledge translation role of like simplifying the messages and making them more relevant to citizens' lives, that think tanks are able to connect these big macroeconomic issues to things that are really relevant. David, how about you in Mexico? Can you share a few examples on the role of think tanks and any current examples on how your organization has been tasked with holding governments accountable for delivery of services?
I don't want to be alarmist or too negative, but I have to start saying that things in Mexico are changing very fast and not to the right direction. First of all, the roles of think tanks are changing very fast in the sense that they used to be bridges and channels of communications and understanding between civil society and government or public institutions in general. And nowadays, with this administration, civil society organizations and civil society in general are being under attack. There is a hostile relationship between the government and the organizations, which it is not possible anymore to have this kind of traditional or strategic communication between civil society organizations, particularly think tanks and government and officials and public or governmental agencies. I think think tanks are more walls of defense, are dams that are trying to contain these attacks, these disqualifications, these persecutions, which are serious. The president of Mexico, in his everyday morning conferences, press conferences, he points out names of institutions, of think tanks, leaders, of civil society leaders, and that's and it's not only about this disqualification, public disqualification, but also concrete actions like threatening with audits and investigations to these people. And I want to give a very important example of one of the most strategic think tanks in Mexico nowadays that is working on anti-corruption and transparency issues, which is Mexicanos contra la Corrupción, Mexicans Against Corruption. The president himself has pointed out the name of the founder and the director, the current director, as people receiving funding from foreign countries, which is partly true, but it's not a crime. That's totally legal and legitimate. And I can put many, many examples like this. And on the other side, the president and this administration, they don't give much value to information, to evidence, to data, because Mexico is age of post-truth fake news, which is more close to the previous US administration, Trump administration, in the sense that the president denies the evidence, the facts, the things that are really going on in the country. And in that sense, the main product, the main result, the main contribution of think tanks, which is precisely strategic information, data, facts, and evidence, are not really demanded or valued or used by this administration at the national level. So in that sense, think tanks are producing something that is not valued by this administration, by this government, and are under attack in a hostile relation because this government don't believe in civil society. The president, as a populist, as an authoritarian leader, believes in the people, in el pueblo, but not in civil society, which is different. So I have to say that this is also true in a less tension, in a less tense situation in Brazil, with a populist of a different sign from a right-wing political party, but that also defies reality, facts, and evidence, and that hates civil society, like many presidents in Latin America these days, that they don't, because they cannot control these organizations, because they are independent. And the risk is not to be too close to power. The risk is being too far from power, not to influence in governmental decisions, not to influence policy. And also, not only depending on other sources of funding, but to simply disappear because you become irrelevant in the public discussion.
So I want to give Alfonsina and Kwame a chance to react to that. But I do wonder, as think tanks are playing this maybe perceived as sort of holier than thou role of holding governments accountable, are they doing enough themselves about, transparency around the sources of their funding? I mean, Kwame mentioned 80% of your funding every year comes from foundations or other probably international donors. Is that on your website? Like, is that do you have a transparency policy? I think more and more think tanks do, and they have also been held accountable for transparency on the funding side. So I wondered if either of you wanted to react to what David said, and it looks like we may have just lost David temporarily. If you wanted to react to some of his thoughts before we move to the next round of questions.
I'll speak actually more towards what donors can do, because I think Kwame will be much better positioned to speak about what think tanks can do. And I think David's example right now is quite critical, especially in places where authoritarian regimes and closing of civic space are happening and becoming more and more common. And a very common tactic is to use as a strategy to criticize the lack of legitimacy of think tanks. And Kwame can speak to this. I think one of the problems is there really aren't any much more sources of funding. So I'll let him speak to that. But I do think that there's a role that donors can play bolstering think tanks that are in that situation. I think one is the way in which donors fund is really important. Years ago, I did a research project on think tanks, and I interviewed about 50 think tanks in the American continent, ranging from think tanks that have TV studios to really smaller, newer think tanks. And I don't think a single one did not say that one of their main challenges was funding. Let's start with the fact that there's a scarcity of funding. And on top of that, most funders, particularly private foundations, tend to fund with very specific strategies, which silo think tanks into, in a way, having to adapt to what that strategy is, and usually funding projects. So most think tanks find themselves having to, instead of having a strategic and holistic approach to the issues that are happening in their country, have to basically piecemeal different projects that cater to very different international donors, particularly strategic in my point of view. So I think that if you're interested in evidence-based national think tanks, I think ideally funders should provide general support grants to think tanks and allow think tanks to really cater to their country. We know from evidence that context matters, and international strategies that don't allow for that flexibility, particularly from funders, to adapt to a particular context, I think is one of the main challenges that think tanks face, and I think one that donors have a role. I think another strategy is, advocating for equitable partnerships and collaboration amongst not only think tanks in a particular country, but also with other social movements. We know that coalitions are much harder to attack. In the case of that David just mentioned, there's one particular organization that receives international funding, and there's a particular target with a name and a last name. That would be much harder if it's a coalition of 20 think tanks and 20 organizations that are dispersed throughout a country. Attacking them becomes really much more attack on civil society than on a particular person. So I think that funders can also adapt their own funding strategies so that they're advocating for much more collaborative partnerships and coalitions, which is to the advantage of the think tanks. Welcome, David. And then finally, I think linked to this point, there's also, a need to fund diversely. And I know that I was guilty of this, and there are reasons for why sometimes private foundations are not well set up to do this. But when you fund mostly elite organizations that are in the capital, and there are, the usual suspects that most other international funders fund, it's really easy to assemble civil society for government. You attack 20 organizations that are based in Mexico City, and that's it, you're done. If as a donor, you can provide diverse funding that is not only within the capital and not only think tanks, it's much harder for governments to disassemble and to attack civil society because it's much more diverse. So I think also in that regard, promoting, and this was something that was, I think, quite successful in my own experience at the Hewlett Foundation, for example, promoting cross-movement building. So think tanks, work organizations, and civil movements, which, by the way, also are the ones who provide the movements that are sometimes necessary to counteract the closing of civic space. Research and evidence base can only go so far, but when governments are attacking, a lot of these, we've seen this over and over in the US, it's social movements and the mobilization of people that are actually, sort of the final frontier. So I think that funders also have a role in improving the ways in which they fund and how they fund that can, in a way, protect civil society from closing.
Thanks a lot, Alfonsina. So Kwame, I'll hand it over to you. You can weave in, your reaction about the role that funders can play as well, and what you've seen in the Kenyan experience.
All right, let me start with the Kenyan experience. I think it's true. We at the Institute of Economic Affairs say that while it is not strictly required by law, we should know that if you're going to ask government to be accountable for public expenditure, our Achilles heel then becomes the possibility that somebody will ask us, what about you? So we don't wait. So what we do is, as a matter of policy and statements, our manual requires us that every time an audit is completed and has been approved, it must be placed on our website, and it's within 7 days once our board approves it. Our formation is also different because the IEA is an association, so we have members who pay a subscription. So obviously, because we have General Assembly, and the nature of our association requires that those disclosures be made anyway, because we don't have, and some of them, a few our members are not even Kenyan. They're simply people who lived here, whether as expatriates, and have gone away. And so that obligation by law with those reports available, it becomes necessary, therefore, to have it on our website. And the third point was, I think 3 years ago, 3 editions of a report that I thought was very useful, and this is, I come to be honest, Transparify. Somebody, of course, who had some work experience with the Think Tank Initiative went out, and among the things he did was actually to put together a ranking of disclosures. And the IEA, for all the 3 editions that were produced, were 5-star. Why? Because we demand, our biggest program is transparency and an opportunity, a platform for citizens with evidence to have discourse around the public. So yes, we don't wait for that question. But we come from a culture in Kenya where government itself sometimes uses, even despite access to information, to disclosures. I think that question about, yes, coming back to think tanks and trying to show that think tanks actually, or civil society in general, receives money for which they're not perfectly accountable. So I think the way to do that is actually simply make sure those disclosures are available, in addition to asking questions and audited reports. So it's not just disclosures about who funds us, which is available on a list on our website, who our funders are and our partners, but also our audited reports are available. And why many think tankers tend to be very hesitant, I actually think that makes you heave a sigh of relief, because you know that nobody's going to ambush you tomorrow with a question about, it's probably have ventilated all those issues. And I think what funders could do is to broaden it, try and provide institutions that are actually an ecosystem of think tanks, so that it's not just one, obviously to spread the risk as well, but also to develop capacities that allows think tanks to be sustainable. But I think the kind of work that is done that allows think tanks benchmark themselves against their peers in terms of disclosures, for instance, then it doesn't matter. We can then go to the argument by saying, look, we are telling you who funds us for what reason. Let's have a discussion. But I'm not going to be embarrassed that because I'm not able to find a Kenyan to actually support the work that I think is necessary, there's pushback, and you only push back pre-disclosures by telling them, yes, here is a report. Let's have the discussion that you want to. So don't speak woolly numbers. Come and tell us.
David, let's go over to you. Any reaction on the role that donors could play to better support, especially in Mexico right now, with civil societies just being shut down? Essentially, the numbers are declining quite drastically. What role can foreign funders play? And maybe if you want to get into what the sustainability journey looks like, is it just to weather the current political cycle, or is there a longer term game for international?
I would say it's both. It's structural, and we have a problem with that, and that was already a problem since many years ago. But also is the moment, is the timing of what is going on in the country. And I do agree with everything that Alfonsina said. Sorry that I missed a moment. I had a problem of connection. Maybe the government is not very happy that is listening what we are saying here. But basically, I want to add another argument that plays against think tanks. And that's one of the problems that Alfonsina and Kwame mentioned. Think tanks in the transparency, accountability, and participation agenda, think tanks have contributed a lot, but the problem is that this kind of contribution is not really very popular. People are thinking in public services, in access to basic services and things like that. And these other discussions are too sophisticated, too technical, too technocratic. And it's hard to translate, and that's one thing that some think tanks have done with certain success to a certain point, but not very extended. I mean, how to translate the importance of access to information to common people? How do they use this tool for their benefit, for their well-being, for their interest? That's not very easy. And once you do that, it's for a very particular sector of few people. It's not that it's very extended. So that the problem with the attack to not only to think tanks but to these agendas is that nobody's defending them. Nobody's really defending democracy in the abstract sense or transparency in this strategic sense. People defend their scholarships, their transfers, their programs, social programs, and things like that. So that's another challenge. So in that sense, international funders, of course, now are more needed than ever. I would say this is a more important moment than before. And it's a paradox because they have been around for many years, many decades. And the work that they have done through the think tanks, through civil society organization, is being lost. And that's a concern for everyone. So I would say that we have to rethink the way to approach civil society and think tanks, how to fund common causes, how to build new networks, how to create leagues and federations, how to shield organizations, how to protect some with others, how to bring people together and build common fronts. I don't know. We have to think totally out of the box. And maybe an example is when Alfonsina knows this better than anyone, when Hewlett used to convey and invite people from different sectors and organizations to talk together and try to do something together. The problem is that if civil society is dispersed, is scattered, is more vulnerable under the attacks of the government. Civil society, what remains of civil society organization in Mexico and in Latin America, have to work together, and maybe even internationally, so that when one organization, Mexican organization, is under attack, other organizations, maybe from Argentina, or Brazil, or Peru, can react and can defend. Like Article 19, which is a global organization, which is very prestigious in Mexico, was under attack last week by the president himself, saying that is totally aligned with foreign interests. When this organization used to defend journalists, when some journalists were covering López Obrador campaign when he was opposition. So the moment is really tough, really difficult, really uncertain. So I would make a call to international donors and funders and organizations not to leave the region and to try to build bridges among the defenders of democratic institutions in Latin America.
Thanks very much, David. I wonder, Kwame or Alfonsina, if you have put out some creative ideas around how funders could think outside the box and work, not even within a country, not only nationally, but actually bridge and create some global kind of support system for one another. Alfonsina also mentioned some ideas as well about how donors could support more diverse and this idea of coalitions.
Yeah, I think everything that has been said resonates with me and my as a think tanker and as a funder. A couple of other things occurred to me. One is, and this is something only in private foundations only Ford and Hewlett do, but I think is also incredibly critical, which is funding organizational strengthening. A lot of think tanks, you can't, for example, be transparent if you don't have an accountant, if you don't have verified fiscal reports. And there's a lot of things that some private foundations ask for that you need resources for. But if you're not providing general support grants, then it's really difficult to fund it when you're piecemealing from different projects. So I think in addition, there's also this idea of strengthening the organizations themselves. As David said, you're shielding them by providing, strong communications, strong strategic thinking, strong monitoring and evaluation systems that they can then sort of use as when attacked. Here's the methodology we've used, how we arrived at these conclusions, including as well, financial resources and transparency to have sort of very transparent and clear accountability mechanisms. Governance and boards are another issue that I think are, to be quite honest, I think are something that I think think tanks, it's very common in Mexico. I don't know about other countries, but to have boards that just exist in on a website, but they actually never come together. They don't provide oversight and accountability. And I think that puts you at risk, because if you can't promote transparency and accountability and advocate for that from the government if you yourself are not doing so. So I think that's another area of organizational strengthening that think tanks could sort of work on. And then another idea occurred to me around sort of international funding being putting some think tanks at risk. And there's at Co-Impact, one of the gaps that were identified that Co-Impact is filling is the idea of pooled funds in a way to fill in two gaps. One is that there are many funders who don't really know where to put in their money, and of course they can't put it in a private foundation because they're privately endowed. But they're there to sort of for philanthropic strategic funding. And second of all, if you were to find, for example, an organization in Mexico or Kenya or Brazil that would be willing to take pooled funds from different people, and this can include private sector, corporate sector, and private sort of foundations money, but it's managed locally and managed by somebody within the country, that could be another sort of creative way in which international donors could get around this sort of easy target of particularly authoritarian regimes trying to close down on civic space.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Alfonsina. Do you think that with the pooled funds that are managed locally, as things shift a little bit politically in these contexts, that there'd be more space for crowding in some domestic funders, some ways to kind of create incentives of matching grants by foreign foundations if another domestic philanthropist was able to put in money, that there would be a matching? Or do you see any other mechanisms for kind of bringing in more domestic funding as things hopefully open up in the future?
Absolutely. And I think that's critical. In places like, Brazil and Mexico included, there's a lot of high net worth individuals. It's not because that there's lack of resources work towards. One is what you just pointed out, finding creative ways to move towards more regional, local funding, which can then, if the mechanism is there, that's already an incentive for maybe a high net worth individual who is within the country to say, oh, well, that already exists. They have grant making sort of experience. There's a mechanism to make grants. It also reduces, in the case of Co-Impact, for example, it reduces also the reporting requirements for folks who are receiving the grants. If you're pooling the funds, this also happened in Hewlett with a Women's Funds Collaborative that we put together. One of the ideas was all of the donors who put money into this pooled fund agree then to one single sort of requirement, right? There's one proposal that goes out to all grantees. There's one reporting requirement, which is really simple once a year. And you're streamlining also, because that's another one of the issues that think tanks face. When you're applying for 30 different projects from 30 different funders, those are 30 proposals and 30 reports, which in some cases is not just once a year, it can be trimestral. So you have people who are analysts and directors spending most of their time fundraising and filling out the requirements for funders rather than actually being strategic to really complex political issues. So I think that's definitely one of the ways in which a pooled fund can be, just for a variety of reasons, much simpler for both local as well as international donors to be more strategic and shielding organizations from.
Thanks, Alfonsina. David, I'm going to hand it back to you. And we've lost Kwame temporarily. Hopefully he joins us. We have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any questions, I've sort of been fielding the questions. I haven't seen any questions come in from our audience. But perhaps, David, you have either some more musings, or if you have any questions for Alfonsina, or if Kwame comes back, that you want to direct to them.
No, I totally agree. I think the think tanks and civil society organizations are facing additional problems. Those kind of bureaucratic obstacles were already an issue for these organizations that cannot devote too many resources to do that, but those are requirements, those are conditions from the funders. Nowadays, you have to really be more reactive, more fast, because things are changing too fast. And I would say that definitely we have to think out of the box and try to finance these pool funds so that it's easier to have access to them, to have this kind of general support financing, so that institutions can develop these strengths and capacities to face all these requirements and conditions, but without losing sight at the most important issues going on. These other discussions are important, but are secondary, I would say, even though are conditions for funding and for accessing to this financing. But I would say that today we are in an emergency situation in Latin America, where think tanks and civil society organizations have to be rescued, have to be protected, have to be shielded against political attacks, against indifference of society in general, and because these are very important counterbalances, check and balances for restraining power in Latin America. Otherwise, if democratic institutions are failing, are not doing their work, are not playing their role, what is left are these kind of organizations that, because they are independent, critic, autonomous, can do the work that oppositions and check and balances are not doing. This is the tragedy of Latin America, that the institutional weakness of our states is such that now the opposition is using the information that these think tanks are producing precisely because nobody else is doing that. The oversight institutions, the institutions in charge of opening up governments, auditing governments, to do fiscalization of governments, are not doing their part. Actually, many of these institutions have been captured and are being co-opted by the central power. And the remaining independent institutions in this country, some of them are think tanks.
Okay, thanks, David. I just wanted to, I want to give Kwame a chance to come back in and maybe say a few final words. Before I do, there is one question in the chat from Sophie, who asks, how can think tanks fundraise when it's hard to fit their activities into projects? Because they want to have that flexibility that Alfonsina spoke about, whether it's accounting, governance issues, organizational capacity strengthening issues, when foundations rarely fund independently of projects. So I know, Alfonsina, maybe I'll hand that one over to you. You've given some examples of where foundations do have some broader mandates, but it is true that most funders are pretty limited still.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer for Sophie, but I think there's a few things. I've been on the fundraising side as well, so I feel your pain, Sophie, and I know this is how it works. I think there's a couple of. One is foundations are not very transparent about the strategies, so I think we also need that. A lot of foundations have sort of a very high-level blurb on their website, but it actually takes getting to know the program officers and the directors to really figure out, particularly in country, what that looks like. So I would say, Sophie, just invest in that, in those relationships by not necessarily, it is networking, but more than that, it's about understanding sort of the thinking of foundations and how their strategies look. I would also encourage think tanks to really calculate their real costs. One of the things that we've seen, I saw at the Hewlett Foundation, was that projects were really under-calculated, because you're not just calculating, the costs field trips, but there are sort of fixed costs that are not calculated across those projects. And so you end up basically subsidizing private foundations, which is absurd in terms of your rent and certain costs. So you're really invest in calculating what are the real costs of operating your think tank. The final two comments, one of them is really, this is a hard one, I know, but learn to say no. There might be funders and funding that will end up being more expensive if, especially, funding requirements, reporting requirements, and they're really not funding the costs. I think that's, saying no is one of the hardest to do as who's fundraising, but I think it is a very important one. And linked to that, avoiding mission creep. I think one of the things that happens to many think tanks and organizations is, by saying yes to all of these projects that are so sort of dispersed a lot and really missing on the strategic focus that makes your particular think tank unique and valuable. So I think tied to the saying no, there are things that maybe your think tank isn't as well known for, you're not well set up to do, you don't have staff that's what they know how to do best. And maybe there's space to sort of cut back on some of those things.
Thanks a lot, Alfonsina. I think we've kind of covered a lot of the territory, and it seems to me there's a clear case that's being made for think tanks, and particularly in the space of transparency and accountability. And there's interest and willingness on behalf of donors to be creative and collaborative in seeking out solutions. Before we close off for today, Kwame, I'm sorry you got cut off, so I wonder if you want to share any final reflections from the discussion this morning or this afternoon for you.
Okay, sorry, my apologies. We had a power cut and then I had to walk around to find the closest link. Yes, just what I was saying before was that it's true that partnerships are valuable, but also partnerships come with other costs that people have to burden. So yes, I think it's one thing to try and go with them. I also think that Sophie asked a question about other sources of revenue. That's true, but for a country such as Kenya, I think private foundations tend to supplement direct service delivery from government. They're not as interested, or maybe we haven't been persuasive enough about trying to make them understand the thinking, the analysis and synthesis that allows for government programs to work much better. I think think tanks are always going to have to be here, responding to the policy context in which they, and the ability at all times to understand political economy is an essential thing for us to essential tool to have. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, David or anyone else, any final thoughts?
One final thought. I would say that also think tanks have a certain responsibility of what is going on in the region and in this country, because these kind of more sophisticated strategic civil society organizations were not able to translate their knowledge, their capacity, their contribution to the general public. But that's a structural problem of education and culture. It is hard for the general public to understand what kind of contribution these organizations produce, because it's not easy to understand indicators, evaluations, plans, and things like that. But still, I would say that the most successful think tanks in Mexico that were able to translate somehow their contribution to the general public through partnership, through different forms of communications, pieces of information, and so on, are those who are more valued, more recognized, and in that sense more appreciated by certain sectors. But still, the popularity of the president, the access to the public by the government, the asymmetric relationship between civil society organizations and the Mexican state is so unbalanced, so unequal, that the conflict is obviously totally unfair. So in that sense, I would say that we should persuade the people around the president, certain ministers and political actors that do understand the importance of civil society, to persuade the president that the enemy is not civil society, that the adversary is somewhere else, but that think tanks can be collaborators, can be bridges, can be allies for development. But that's a struggle that we are fighting in this country.
Okay, David, well, lots of work ahead for further collaboration between think tanks and donors, both international and domestic too, and working with governments. So let's keep the conversation going. There will be a summary of the session available, and hopefully you guys can join some of the other sessions at the conference. So thanks very much for everyone's time today, and we'll look forward to being in touch again soon.